Alright, hello everyone. I didn't really plan on making this video, but I had some spare time and I thought myself, what the hell, why not do it? So today we are talking about the Nikon D2X, which is a camera that I've had in my hands for a little bit more than a year and a half right now, so it's a camera that I've had plenty of time to try to understand what this camera is about, and I'm not sure I have understood everything, because to me this camera does not make sense. But anyway, before we get into what this camera is about in 2025, I want to go on on the history slope of the tangent that I often go after, and that's to explain the importance and the relevance of the Nikon D2X into the camera landscape. So we need to go back in 2003 when Nikon released the Nikon D2H. And the D2H is a completely different beast compared to the D2X, of course, but it was mainly due to the release of the Canon EOS 1D back in late 2001. The idea with the D2H, as I said in my D2H review, which you can go check out, the idea behind the D2H release was to match that camera. Okay, it was meant to be a sports camera, it was meant to be 8 frames per second, around 4 megapixels, around the same image quality and similar autofocus. The problem with that is that Canon had a bit of a head start there, because first of all they had 2-year head start, and in 2004, right after the D2H was released, Canon released the EOS 1D Mark II, which had double the resolution, still about as fast, slightly faster, and had other niceties added on top of it. And the D2H at the time was completely outclassed by the 1D. And so Nikon could not afford to do that game of one up another, I release a camera, you release another, it's better, I release another one, it's better, etc. They needed to have a camera that would compete for every camera that Canon would have and would be price competitive for years. That was what they needed, otherwise they would simply disappear on the professional market. So in 2004, Nikon has that situation. On one hand, they have the professional market aimed at high-resolution studio kind of things, which is held by the Canon 1DS series, which is full frame, which right now in 2004 there is the 1DS Mark II, which is 16 megapixel full frame camera. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the 1D Mark II, which is 8.5 megapixels, shoots at 8.5 frames per second, and is the dedicated sports and action camera from Canon. Now, Nikon wanted to compete with both of them, but they simply couldn't. The D2H, couldn't really compete with the sports aspect of things, and obviously doesn't compete with the high resolution aspect of the 1DS. And their last high resolution quote unquote camera, which was the Nikon D1X, that camera simply cannot compete with even the 1D when it comes to resolution. So that too is out of the window. So they thought that they would release a camera that would compete on both segments. Basically, they took the body of the D2H, changed the sensor from a 4 megapixel JFET to a 12 megapixel CMOS, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and they added some blinky doodads. They kept the 8 frames per second burst rate that the mechanical shutter was rated for, and that allowed them, with some trickery I guess, to compete with both cameras at the same time. Basically, the D2X has a very sharp 12 megapixel sensor, to the point that it competes with most 16 megapixel sensor in terms of sharpness. At least it competes, I have several APS-C 16 megapixel cameras on hand, and it competes with all of them, on terms of macro contrast and detail. No question, those cameras are about equal. So that's pretty good 12 megapixel sensor there. And of course it competed well with the 16 megapixel full frame in the 1DS. Still APS-C, still lower dynamic range, higher noise, etc. But still, for someone that wanted to not pay the $8,500 that the 1DS Mark II asks from you, you could pay $5,500 and have something that delivered roughly the same amount of detail. So that was pretty good. Also, the fact that it has an APS-C sensor allows you to use cheaper lenses because it's only using the sensor aspect of those lenses, whereas with the N1DS, not only do you have a much more expensive camera, but you also will need to have much more expensive lenses to be sharp up to the corners, which is not a requirement that the D2X has. In that 12 megapixel reading the full sensor mode, you are limited to 5.3 frames per second burst rate, which is already not that bad and already faster than the 1DS. I think it was 4 frames per second that it could do, the 1DS Mark II. But this is where Nikon did a bit of trickery there. To allow the camera to shoot up to 8 frames per second, which is what the mechanical shutter was rated for, they added a crop mode. So instead of the 12 megapixel sensor, you would use only a 7.5 sensor portion of that sensor, which would increase the crop factor from 1.5, so APS-C, to 2.0, so 3:2 aspect ratio, but roughly like macro 4/3 sensor size area. And that would allow the 8 frames per second shooting. And that is what allowed them to compete kind of well with the 1D Mark II. Of course, the 1D Mark II has a much larger sensor. It was an APS-H sensor. It still has 1 megapixel advantage, which is not that much, but still it has it. But burst rate wise, the D2X is in spitting distance, really. So it is in spitting distance for both resolution and burst rate, and really for sports and action, wildlife and whatever, where you would want to have those fast frame rates and good autofocus and everything, having more reach is generally something that you would want. So having that 2.0 crop factor instead of the 1.3 in the 1D Mark II was an advantage for some people that did not want to have as big or as expensive of lenses, which was another advantage towards the affordability and the price to performance ratio, I would say. And so with that, I would say that Nikon has achieved to compete well with the 1DS and the 1D with a single camera that costs significantly less than, of course, the 1D and 1DS added together, but even a single model. The 1D Mark II was $6,500 and the 1DS Mark II was $8,500. This was released at $5,500. So you have a nice discount even compared to the 1D Mark II, and you have 1D Ace Mark II capabilities in terms of resolution and detail capture and everything. So that was pretty much 2 cameras in one. And that was in 2005, 20 years ago. And that was a pretty ballsy move, to be honest, from Nikon to release that camera. And it gave them, I would say, the necessary budget and monetary wellness to then develop a camera that would completely transform what people would associate to Nikon, which is the D3 and other cameras that would be derivative from that, so the D300, D700, etc. So that's the history about the Nikon D2X. Was it a good camera then? Of course. Was it a successful camera? Of course. There's no argument about those 2 points for sure. However, we are now in 2025 and you can still buy a Nikon D2X on the used market. I did. Does it make any sense to buy it? Well, when I reviewed the D2H, it did not make a ton of sense to buy that camera, and this is something that I realized very, very quickly when I saw the image quality. And for some people that would be nostalgic of these kind of images, why not? But to me, it had like point-and-shoot image quality in a full-gripped professional camera body, which does not make a ton of sense to me. So that's where the D2H fell short. But when I got the D2X, I thought to myself, well, the D2H has that 4 megapixel point and shoot aesthetic to the pictures with very low dynamic range, very high noise, very low resolution and everything. maybe the D2, but I love the D2H for the ergonomics and the shooting experience and everything. I love that camera for that. And I thought to myself, maybe the D2X with that 12 megapixel sensor would be a usable D2H in terms of image quality for what I want. I want about 10 to 12 megapixel for my print work and everything, so that would be filling all the boxes in theory. But the problem here is that even though it keeps all the good things of the ergonomics of the D2H and everything, it also, has other problems of its own. First of all, we need to talk about the ISO ranges, because this camera is not a low light beast at all. The ISO range from that camera goes from 100 to 800. 800 is the maximum. You can push that a little bit further. I think it goes up to 3200 in the high 2 setting. Yeah, that's about it. But there, it's not usable, okay? There are not usable images. Maybe you can use the high 1 or the high 0.7 setting, and that would be kind of okay. But still, that's only a theoretical ISO 1600 equivalent that you would be able to use, and you would get about the same image if you shot just ISO 800 and push one stop, which means that it simply, decreases your ability to push files in post. So effectively, the native top ISO that I would be using on that camera is 800. 800 is like normal conditions if you are shooting, I don't know, in the middle of a forest, if you are shooting at dusk or something like that. This is not something that I would bat an eye on any other camera to shoot at ISO 800. Yeah, okay, sure, I shoot at ISO 800. On that camera, that's the top native ISO. That's a pretty noisy image already. So this is where I have a bit of a problem. Sure, the images are less noisy than the one that are coming from the D2H. Of course, they have the same noise level on a pixel basis, but this camera has 3 times the resolution of the D2H, so it compensates for that a little bit. But the image quality is still not great. It will only be good in good light, or with a tripod with plenty of exposure time and everything. And it's not a camera that is super versatile to use either. Like, those files are pretty good to edit, but I personally do not see the benefit in macro contrast compared to, I don't know, my D700 or my D300, which I sold, but I kept the D700 to compare it to. But, sorry. The main thing with the D2H, sorry, the D2X, I'm getting confused a little bit, but the main thing with the D2X right now is that this camera is still kind of expensive. It's not 5,500. It's not 5,500 bucks. Absolutely not. But if you want to get one, you are expected to pay around 200 bucks, sometimes more. On MPB, you sometimes see those D2X or D2XS, which are the refreshed 2006 version, which had a new menu system and everything. But whatever, you always see them going for like 240, 250 euros, which to me is completely nuts. It's absolutely nuts, because if I compare the D2X to, I don't know, a camera that came out 2 years after, which is the D300, the D300 has a better sensor, a higher native ISO of 200 instead of 100, so technically I think the D2X could have some dynamic range advantage, but in fact when you really look at these metrics specifically, actually it doesn't. And it goes much higher in ISO too than top native ISO with 3200, which is 800 for reference. It also shoots 6 frames per second at 12 megapixel. You add the grip, you can shoot 8 frames per second at 12 megapixel. This is not something D2X can do. And on top of that, you have the new multicam 3500DX or autofocus sensor. So you have that 51-point system with 3D tracking and everything. It is absolutely not the same class of camera, and what D300 is totally usable today, the D2X is a little bit cumbersome to use, and the autofocus system is much less refined and also much less good overall. And yeah, then you look at the price, and the D300 is like 100 bucks. Give or take like 20 bucks. Sometimes you have a very clean one for 120. Sometimes you find one for 80 bucks and it's fine. The one I had bought was 59 euros. Like, this is a very cheap camera. This is not a camera that costs you a lot of money, and this is much less expensive than D2X, and yet it's much better in my opinion. Even to add insult to injury, for about the same price as a D2X today, what you can buy as a professional grade Nikon camera, which is not especially higher resolution than this, but simply better image quality overall, higher dynamic range, much lower noise, better autofocus, better burst rate, maybe even like better handling. Well, you can have something like this. This is D700, this is a legendary camera which still has very good image quality today. I would not call the D2X good image quality for 2025 standards. The D700 can go up to 6400 ISO at the top native ISO range, and the files are clean enough, because that's a full frame sensor, the files are clean enough even at 6400 ISO to push to like 12,800 if you want to. This is the D700, even though it has no stabilization whatsoever. You can add a lens that has no stabilization whatsoever. Thanks to that ISO capabilities, this is a camera that you can still shoot with in low light, whereas the D2X you simply cannot. This camera is not able to do that. And if you want to shoot with a faster shutter speed and a lower ISO, you will have dramatically underexposed images, which if you want to push them in post, you will not get much benefits from them. So anyway, to me, the D2X, I wanted to love that camera so much, I wanted the files to be great, but the fact of the matter is that the files are not competing well with like even contemporary-ish Nikon cameras from like 2007, 2008. Those cameras are already like 17 years old in 2025, and they are already like so much better than the D2X that this is not even funny for for lovely D2X to compete. So this is where I will say that you can still find use cases for that if you really want to have a rugged with a large like ENEL4 battery like this, in an integrated body without an added grip, which would be maybe too big. The D700 is quite a bit larger than the D2X with a bottom battery grip. But if you want to have that large battery in a rugged body, which is all one piece, and you want to have still about 12 megapixel and you only intend to shoot in good light, then okay, why not? Maybe the D2X could be a decent option. But at the same time, you could get two D300s for the same price of a single D2X. So while this camera is good, and the color science is good, and the macro contrast is good, honestly, I cannot really see much of a difference compared to the images from a D300, which were already pretty sharp and with a good color science as well. And these images have lower noise, high dynamic range. Yeah, I think you get the idea now. So, do I recommend the D2X? I think you can get the idea that I don't actually recommend the D2X. If you want to have a professional camera, don't only look at cameras that have an integrated battery grip. Those are not the only professional cameras around. And as it stands, the D2X is not more professional than something like a D700. The D3 is more professional than the D700 because it has that large body aesthetic and it also has dual card slots. As it stands, the D2X only has one card slot anyway, so the difference is really, really minor, but the image quality difference in terms of, what you can capture with it are pretty massive, and this is something that is not playing in the favor of the D2X at all. So unless you find one for really, really cheap price, the way I did, I would not look at the D2X, I would just go past it. The time of that camera was in 2005, 2006. 2000 and onwards, that camera was already finished. It had played its role in the history of Nikon, and I mean, that's all we can ask for a camera, I guess, but it's not a camera that it's still modern or it's still giving out modern performance or anything like that. If you have a D2X and you like it, the images are still fine. You don't need to feel the need to upgrade or anything like that. And if you like the camera, that's great. But if you don't have a D2X and you were maybe thinking about getting one, I would maybe stop myself in my tracks, okay, and look at the other options that are also available in this kind of price range, because we are starting when it comes to older DSLRs, you are starting to get in a price range where cameras are getting seriously good. I'm thinking for $250 you can get a very high shutter count, kind of beat up Nikon D600, which has double card slot, ENEL15 battery, 24 megapixel full frame sensor, yada yada yada. You get the idea. Like, you can get a substantially better image quality, performance, whatever you want, for that kind of money, and this is, in my opinion, a way to waste one's money to recommend the D2X. So yeah, great camera. I like shooting with it, but as it stands, I can't recommend it. By the way, just so we can clear out things, I'm not keeping that camera for the shooting experience or what this camera brings me. I'm only keeping that camera for the collector's aspect of things, because it is an important camera. It's not in Nikon's history. I'm interested in the Nikon's brand as we know it, and yeah, that's pretty. It sits tight next to my D1X, and that's pretty much the only use I have for it. On the other hand, it's a defective camera. The autofocus system is out of whack. There is one bent pin in the CF card port, which doesn't impact my ability to read or write images to the card, so that's good, but I mean, that's still worthy of being mentioned. And the rear screen is foggy, and the front dial is super sticky. So this is not really a camera in perfect condition. Also it was probably used in the studio or something like that, because it has like a 350k shutter count, something, which is well past the rated shutter life of the D2X anyway. So yeah, this is just a shelf camera to feel good and look at my nice D2X, because it's a beautiful looking camera. I really like the look of it. I prefer the D2 series compared to the D3, but that's just personal. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video nonetheless. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.